And so that's one thing that I see happening, is just this coming down to what is that essence before it got dressed up in all this different cultural, religious baggage. And along with this, there's this sort of collective honing that's going on. There are, hundreds of thousands, millions of us, each in our own way, searching for that deeper reality, that deeper truth, for that personal awakening. And we're each making our own discoveries and sharing that with each other. And as we do that, gradually, I think we're honing into rediscovering what that essential wisdom is for ourselves. I remember once, a little while ago, I was giving a talk. It was actually in England, and somebody in the audience said, he was from Germany, so I always remember his accent, and he said at the end of the talk, he said, "Mr. Russell," he said, "what is it you are saying that's different from everybody else?" His presumption is, if he's coming to hear me, then I should be saying something that's different from what everybody else was saying. And my response was, nothing, I hope. Because if I'm saying something different, that's where we're off track. I think what we're coming to is this universal understanding. And one thing that's fueling this, of course, is the information technologies we have, not just the books and videos and things, but the internet is fueling this. I mean, one example of that is the whole thing which happened with Eckhart Tolle and Oprah Winfrey a couple of months ago, where he had 2 million people tuning into a web broadcast, just focusing on very sort of basic approach to being present, which I think is the key aspect of awakening, is coming back to being in the present moment. And I mean, that's just one example of how we're learning from each other in this. And as we learn from each other, I mean, I come here, perhaps not so much spiritual stuff here, but I go to other conferences and I hear people I really admire, and I take on something of theirs, and they take on something of mine. I happen to write books, other people read books, but I read theirs. There's this whole process of just gradually making it simpler and clearer as to what it is we're doing here. And it's really just about connecting with who we really are inside, that deeper truth that so often gets covered up by all the things we're told to believe by our culture. And as this process of honing goes on, the whole thing is accelerating. I remember when I first got interested in the whole thing of conscious awakening back in the late 60s, in my local bookstore in Cambridge in England, which was the second largest bookstore in England then, there was one shelf up in a corner which had sort of spiritual books other than Christianity. You know, you find a couple of translations of the Upanishads and a few odd things, but that was it. You now go into any medium-sized small town anywhere in the West and you find bookstores devoted to this stuff. And all those books have come out of people doing their own inner explorations, their own research, looking at themselves, trying practices, sharing that with others. And it's not just books, it's just the number of magazines that's exploded over the last 10, 20 years in this area, and different groups and practices. It's all exploding. And it's really beginning to have an impact on the world. And for me, one of the biggest indicators of the sorts of shifts we're going through is the generational shift that I see happening. And I was saying earlier this morning to some people, I think we're in the third generation of it now. That the parents of the 60s who started bringing up their kids in a slightly different way, their kids, the second generation, have now had their own kids. And there's something that's happening both in how we raise children, but much more in terms of the awareness there. And particularly the whole environmental awareness has come in just the last 30, 40 years. And what I find is so many of the kids, and by kids I'm talking about people, teenagers, people in their early 20s, they're generally children of friends I have, how much wisdom and understanding is there that was never there when I was that age. And we thought we were pretty hip back then. And, you know, compared to probably where the average of society was, we probably were relatively hip. But I think if you could take some of these kids and put them in a time machine and send them back to the late 60s, early 70s, people then wouldn't know what to make of them. Just so much awareness and wisdom. And this to me is a reflection of what's been happening in the culture. It's a collective thing that's happening. And I may be 40 years older than them and have been exploring this stuff for 40 more years, but it doesn't make me actually 40 years wiser. It's like our culture is 40 years wiser. We're all wising up together. And what I see is happening here is, and it's almost invisible, that's why I call it the invisible shift. We are going through a new global spiritual renaissance. When I say new, it's probably the first ever, it is the first ever global spiritual renaissance. And it's global because of the technologies we have, it's happening over the whole globe. We also, of course, have access to teachings, understandings from just about every culture, from every age. You know, we can discover what South American Indians have discovered about the mind, or people in Tibet from different times. We have all of that. 100 years ago, probably all you had was just, if you were lucky enough to have someone with some wisdom in your culture you could appeal to. Now we can really draw upon all that wisdom that's been accumulated over the world. And it doesn't appear as anything spiritual, as a single religion. It's got no leader. This was something Marilyn Ferguson pointed out in her book, The Aquarian Conspiracy. Any of you who remember that? It's a leaderless movement. There are no leaders. In a sense, we're all leading each other, all learning from each other. There are some people who may appear more as leaders, but really we're all leading each other. And this is the movement I'm fascinated in. As I say, it's invisible, but this is what is powering the changes we're seeing in society, the changes we're talking about here. Because the fruits of this, what comes from this inner exploration, is several things. One is there's this freedom from that sort of deep-rooted egocentricity that me first, I'm the most important thing. There's this loosening of the boundaries of the ego that happens. And with that comes a sense of wisdom, what's really important in the world. And wisdom, I define, we'll just go back and say there's this progression which we often talk about, going from data to information to knowledge to wisdom. And people sometimes think, well, wisdom is just a different sort of knowledge. I don't think it is. If you take that progression, you have data, and then you look at the patterns in the data, you get the information, and then you take the information, you generalize the information, you get to knowledge. I see wisdom is about how we use the knowledge we have. And the way I often translate wisdom is it's about discernment. What is useful knowledge? What is appropriate knowledge? How do we use our knowledge for our own good, for the benefit of the planet? And that wisdom, I think, is there in each of us. We all carry that deeper wisdom, but it gets covered up. And part of the awakening of consciousness is getting in touch with the wisdom, the truth that we all know inside anyway. So it's that growth of wisdom which leads to a shift in values of what is actually important. And the other thing that comes is an awakening of the heart, a growth of the heart. And you find this in just about all spiritual traditions. a growth of compassion, a growth of caring, which stretches both from sort of caring for one's own body to one's family, community, and to the planet.